Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to have Annie with us. She's written the book, The Extended Mind, and I loved it. So I reached out to her, and she graciously agreed to come online and talk with us about how we can extend our minds in the classroom. We were talking while we were getting ready about the volume of research you did, Annie, in this book. It was like 70, I counted 73 pages of research.
It's a lot of studies. I read a lot of studies.
You really did. And you put it together in such a way that was organized and made so much sense to me. Why this topic of all the topics that you could have chosen? Why did you choose this extended mind topic?
Yeah, so I'm a science writer who covers research on psychology and cognitive science generally. That's what I've done for most of my career. And about 10 years or so ago, I became especially interested in the science of learning. I'll admit it was totally about me and my personal interests because I had two sons. They're now 12 and 15, but at that time they were, starting school in elementary school. And I just got really interested in how they were learning, how their teachers were teaching them. And at the same time, as a professional writer, I became aware that the science of learning was this incredibly dynamic, interesting, exciting field where all this research was emerging that was both intellectually stimulating and interesting, and also really useful and practical. And I really like the idea of being a bridge between what researchers were discovering and what teachers and parents and students were doing, in schools. And so I started to sort of specialize in covering the science of learning, and with the idea that I would write a book of some kind about the science of learning. But what I lacked was a big idea that would pull all these strands of research together. And I had become interested in some bodies of research that were especially sort of provocative or interesting to me, like embodied cognition, this idea that we think with our bodies, and situated cognition, the idea that where we are affects how we think, and socially distributed cognition, or the idea that we don't just think with our own individual brains, we think with the brains of other people, the minds of other people, and our relationships and our social interactions. So I felt like all of these bodies of research were connected in some way, but it wasn't until I stumbled across the idea of the extended mind that I saw how I could pull all those pieces together into a whole. And the theory of the extended mind was actually proposed by two philosophers in a journal article from 1998. So you can see how far afield I was roaming in my reading and research, because I ended up reading this philosophy journal and coming across this article that the first sentence of the article said something like, "Where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin?" And that question was very interesting to me, provocative to me, because the usual answer to that would be, the mind stops at the skull. It's the brain and mind are kind of identical. And these two philosophers, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, were saying, no, actually thinking is spread out across the body and across physical space and across relationships with other people. And I found this to be such an exciting way of thinking about thinking, and one that had so many implications, particularly for education, that I knew that this was now going to be the sort of umbrella concept under which all this research that I'd been looking at could be gathered.
Yeah, you did an amazing job of pulling it all together and leading the reader from point A to point B. So let's start with the myth of the brain as muscle. I highlighted that in your book because we talk about a lot. It's a muscle. Let's work out our brains, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I think, that the reason that metaphor is so popular and so pervasive is because of the work of Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist who introduced the idea of mindset, growth mindset. And she, she wasn't the first to come up with the idea of brain as muscle, but I think she really made it very popular and very, very commonly used. And I admire Carol, and I admire the work that she's done with the growth mindset. But I do think that when we talk about the brain as muscle, when we tell kids that the brain is like a muscle and that the way to get smarter is by exercising that muscle the way you would exercise your bicep, there's some limitations to that, because I think we've all, as parents or as teachers, seen a kid who's struggling to learn something, struggling to study or understand something, and they're working their brain as hard as they can, but they're not making the headway that they want, and it's frustrating and it's distressing to them. And to tell them to keep working at it is often not as helpful as we would like it to be. So what I like about the extended mind, the theory of the extended mind, is that it gives you so many options, so many choices, instead of sitting there and continuing to, push away at the problem with your brain. Maybe you could go take a walk, you could go outside, you could gesture, you could act it out, you could teach it to someone else, you could tell a story about it, you could debate about it, all these different approaches that just seemed like such a flexible and kind of a more resilient approach to thinking and learning than just kind of sitting there until the work is done, which isn't always going to lead to the most intelligent or effective thinking.
So let's start with embodied cognition, and your first chapter is about interoception. And that's really big right now in schools, and we're talking about it, but you're talking about it a little bit differently than the way we're seeing it. So how does interoception, I don't think we think of it in terms of extending our mind, or as that being a helpful sense that we have that might help us to learn better. So in your chapter, you talk about that. Can you expand on that a little bit? Give us some clues?
Sure. Yeah. And I would love to hear about how interoception is being talked about in schools, because I'm coming at it from, I guess, this different angle. But I became interested in interoception when I think I probably approached embodied cognition at first from the perspective of gesture and movement, these kind of visible, manifestations of the body, but our capacity to be attuned to the internal sensations of our bodies. So this is something that's going on all the time, but we're not always, paying attention to it. In fact, I think our culture really encourages people, and including children and students, to often to suppress that bodily awareness, to kind of push through or power through and grit your teeth. I mean, that's kind of, the growth mindset grit model, where it's just like, kind of bear down and get it done. Whereas the research on interoception suggested that tuning into your internal sensations, taking a moment to feel your heartbeat, if you're aware of that, the sensations of your stomach, your breathing, this flow of sensations is happening all the time, and it actually carries with it a whole lot of information that we wouldn't have access to that we don't have access to unless we tune in to our bodies. So that was some of the most interesting research that I wrote about in the book, was the research suggesting that interoception gives us access to non-consciously stored to information that's stored non-consciously. So, we go through life taking in so much more information than we can really be consciously aware of or consciously processing, but we are storing that information on a non-conscious level. And so when we encounter a new situation, or when we encounter a situation and it bears some resemblance to a situation we've encountered before, it's actually our bodies that can give us a little tap on the shoulder in a way to let us know, like, we've been here before, we've seen this, this would be an adaptive or an effective kind of response. But if we're not attuned to those internal signals, we miss out on that repository of information, that of knowledge that we actually possess, but that we're not going to be aware of if we're not attuned to what our bodies are telling us.
I think right now in schools, interoception is actually like a curriculum. Kelly Mahler has a curriculum, and it's about the kids who lack it, who who have a difficulty with it. But what I liked in the book, what you were talking about, is we all need to develop it. Teachers need to develop it when they're working with their students, to tap into what is the student needing in this moment. And the students, it's something we get to develop, not just because somebody's lacking in it, that we need to focus on it, that it's something we should be doing with everyone.
Right. Yes, it's a valuable capacity for all of us to develop, and we all can develop our interoceptive capacity. There are individual differences in how attuned people are to their internal sensations, but all of us can cultivate that ability. For example, by engaging in the body scan, which is a kind of mindfulness meditation that I describe in the book, that that involves paying accepting, non-judgmental, open-minded kind of attention to all the sensations that are arising in the body. And when you think about how much time we spend directing our attention outward, just getting things done, and paying attention to all the information in our environment, and then how little time we spend actually turning inward and feeling what our body has to tell us, I think we could readjust that balance a little bit.
And when we're tuning in, our students are tuning in, they're feeling like, I'm overwhelmed. I can't do this. I don't have this. Like I'm not learning as fast as the student next to me, or they're starting to feel these kinds of things. That's where we can use some of the extended mind type things with them, like in terms of the environment, what resources do they have available? But until they can tune in and know they're feeling that, it's going to be difficult for them to access those resources, right? So it's good for us to know what resources are available, but until we know that we need them, like we need to take a break, we need to go take a walk. And I really love you talked about moving into the environment and what types of things can we do. So we're in a classroom, we've got all these students, but we're getting a sense, we're tuning in that we're all kind of tired, we're not getting it, we're not moving forward. And teachers are always talking to me about this time, like they feel like we have so much to accomplish in so little time, and they feel like they're always running against the clock. So to take those moments to they can be micro moments, right? They don't have to be, we're in 20 minutes to do a mindfulness. It can be a micro moment in the classroom where everybody just stops for that moment, right? And then when you were talking about where you gaze and where you look in the classroom, I thought, now this is interesting. How could we set up in our classrooms these, even if we don't have any windows, or even if, whatever, we can't get out to nature, we can't go for a walk. Do you have some ideas of what we could do, or how we could set up, like we have quiet corners or calming, we have these things sometimes in our classrooms, but after reading your book, I felt there were ways we could really make them even more powerful.
I was especially struck by the research that I reported on about attention restoration theory, which holds that being in nature, spending time in nature, but even as you were mentioning, sort of brief glances at nature help to restore our attention. Again, we spend so much time thinking about how to manage attention and where to direct attention, and how to help our students do that too. But we don't tend to think as much about sort of not so much the demand side, but the supply side. Like how are we refilling the tank? We're always spending down our attentional resources, but how do we replenish them, and how do we restore them? And it turns out that the fastest and most effective way to do that is by spending time in nature, because the kind of information that we encounter in nature, the kind of stimuli that we encounter in nature, it's very easy for our brains to process. We experience a lot of what scientists call perceptual fluency when we're looking at a natural scene, as opposed to an interior built scene, or even like an urban scene, which has so many sharp edges and fast moving objects and loud sounds. And, if you think about nature, there's a lot of, there's diffuse light, there's gentle movement, there's not a whole lot of variation in color. There's like green and more green, and so it's very easy on the eyes, it's easy on the mind, and we find ourselves, our attention sort of pleasantly diverted, looking this way and that, but it's very different from the very hard-edged kind of attention that we have to pay to our studies or our work. So when we spend some time in nature and our minds sort of naturally go into that more relaxed state, then we can return from our walk in nature, or even just, research suggests that even 40 seconds of looking out the window at a green space can help do this. We return to our work with a refreshed sense of our capacities and our ability to pay attention. There's really interesting research on what scientists call biophilia, which is like humans' affinity for natural materials, natural motifs, and you see this in healthcare settings. Actually, it's made a really big it's had a really big influence on the design of hospitals and other places where people are cared for in medical settings. You'll see often hospitals have a healing garden, or the building itself will be built around a courtyard so that every room has a view of trees. And it's research has demonstrated that people's healing is accelerated when they have a view of trees rather than a view of like a brick wall. And it's my hope that same kind of pervasive influence of biophilic design could be brought to schools. I mean, there's some wonderful examples of it already, but that we could really reinvent schools as being places where nature is welcomed in, and where you see nature every time you turn the corner. Or there's a wonderful school on Staten Island in New York that is almost completely what they call daylight autonomous. Almost all the light in the building comes from natural light. And you can just imagine what a difference that makes just in students' mood and students' state of mind to be in a sunny classroom filled with natural light, as opposed to one that's lit by fluorescent lights. I think we all feel the difference
Yeah. When I was doing my reading, my small groups, we had these fluorescent lights that were always buzzing. And I noticed my kids were really and I was really antsy with it.
Yeah.
So I went to the school board and I said, could I get some natural light? And it made a big difference.
Yeah.
So, doing what we can do. I know it's not always possible to change all of our lighting and that sort of thing, but I feel like being able to do small adjustments, bring in a couple plants or whatever, or just, and I like that idea about not having to be more active to focus, but actually, I think that's really interesting, because I'm school moves, right? I've been doing school moves for 20 years. It's all about, you get them up, you get them active, but I really like that idea of just gazing, just taking that break.
Yeah.
For the teachers and support staff, for everybody.
Yeah. Well, I think those two things that you mentioned, Deborah, like getting kids active, and then also taking moments to gaze at nature, or even, as we were saying, to tune into your internal state. Again, I feel like that those are some really powerful options and choices, as opposed to this idea that is very common, that everything has to come from within, that we have to be like mustering all this internal regulation and internal perseverance. Why not try changing the context or the activity, almost like making change in ourselves from the outside in, which can be so much more effective than just telling kids to grit it out, or pull themselves together and impose that regulation from within. It's actually often a lot easier to do it from the outside.
Yeah, we talk a lot about self-regulation. Those are words we use constantly. And the more I'm studying, I studied a lot of polyvagal theory this summer. I read your book and I was thinking, wow, it's really, now we can move into that third branch where you're building relationships, you're extending your mind through others. And that you're talking about that whole co-regulation. And so what can we do in the classrooms with that? Like, we tend to focus on the ultimate goal is self-regulation. And what I'm understanding in my work is, instead of one set of handprints up there to do your heavy work, you put two. So that you have somebody else that can come with you and can regulate with you. So yeah, share a little bit about that, the extending the mind through relations.
Yeah. Well, it turns out humans are really wired to regulate each other, and that's something that we are a very individualistic culture, you know, and we often put that burden of self-regulation on individual kids instead of thinking about how can we help each other regulate each other. And you know, two things come to mind. One is that interoception piece that we were talking about earlier, and I love the research on social interoception. This idea that when we are connecting with someone and communicating with someone face to face, we tend to subtly mimic their facial expressions, their postures, their gestures, and then we kind of read off our own bodies. We get a sense of what they're feeling because we're reading it off our own bodies. And so I think the more we can cultivate that internal sensitivity, the more we can use that channel to help ourselves understand what the other person is thinking and feeling, because we're getting a little taste of it in ourselves. And then in terms of this is from a chapter called Thinking with Groups, about the importance of synchronous movement, for example, which I think could be a really, you probably already use this with your program of school moves, that when people move together in the same way at the same time, it does an amazing kind of thing to our perception of ourselves and others. We start to think that the lines between ourselves and the others in the group start to blur a little bit. We feel a little bit more connected to them. We feel more positively towards them. We're more inclined to cooperate with them. We're more pro-social towards people with whom we've engaged in synchronous movement. And so that could be dancing together, that could be exercising together, or it could be even something as simple as walking together, because when people walk together, they tend to unconsciously coordinate their movements so that they're walking in sync. And so I tell the story of a school in Minnesota that has a walk or a run before school every morning, and teachers have really noticed that kids come in not only, you know, ready to concentrate because they've had that physical activity, but they've also had the social experience of walking or running with their classmates before they ever enter the classroom.
Yeah, you talked about the whole diversity and you know, some of the, like, in our culture right now, we have so much of, you know, division going on. Mm-hmm. And I enjoyed that part of the book where you talked about these are the ways that we can come back together, mm-hmm. and find our common humanness, you know, in our diversity.
Absolutely. And we need so much to work together and think together. Our problems and our challenges are so daunting that they really can't be solved by individuals alone. We have to learn to think together, and what better place to start learning that than in school. And so I talk about what are some of the conditions of creating a group mind, you know, a sense of groupiness, which is actually a scientific term that researchers use. But how do you create a sense of groupiness such that a bunch of individuals feels like a single entity, like a group? And some of the things I talk about are things like, of course, learning and training together, but also having emotional experiences together, having that synchronous movement that I was talking about. And then engaging in rituals together, which I think, you know, teachers often do a really great job of creating rituals specific to their classroom. And that actually promotes this feeling that, you know, we are a group, and we are, and that in turn makes it easier for the group to think together as one and not as a bunch of disparate individuals.
Yeah, I liked how you said think differently isn't always the best way to think, because my Debinars, I jokingly call them Debinars, used to be think different Debinars. And then after I read your book, I'm like, I'm not putting think different anymore, because can you talk to that? Like, think differently isn't always the way we want to go.
Yeah, that was in a section about how much we emphasize, again, in our individualistic culture, how much we emphasize innovation and originality and being the first to do something. And so I talk about how, you know, we have this bias in our culture against imitating and emulating others, but that can be a very efficient and effective way to learn something from the inside, is to imitate someone who already knows how to do what you're trying to learn, who knows how to do it really well. this research was super interesting to me, that that education systems were once completely based on imitation, and the whole idea was that students needed to imitate the works of the masters, and that's how you got to be good at something. And we do, in American culture in particular, we have such a focus on originality and innovation, and I don't think that's going to change. But I do think there are opportunities to bring in imitation, emulation, the use of models, that students can learn from and copy, and then perhaps introduce their own variations on. It can be a really great way to structure that learning process, so kids aren't starting from zero, but have a kind of model to work from.
One thing I really liked was your offloading, when you're talking about offloading, because I think we all feel like we can't squeeze anything more in. How can we get some of this stuff out?
Yeah. When you're saying that, Deborah, I feel like we all feel like our brains are full. Like there's no vacancy. Yeah. And so part of that feeling, that distressing feeling of like, oh, my head's gonna explode, is that we try to do too much in our heads, and the fact is, the research shows that it's often much more effective and efficient to offload, cognitively offload, to move the contents of our heads out onto physical space, whether that means a whiteboard or a bunch of Post-it notes that we're moving around, or even like a multi-monitor setup, so that you're not just looking at a little screen, but you have enough space, if you're fortunate enough to have like a really big monitor, to kind of lay it all out, and then all these other things become possible, like using embodied resources like your spatial memory, like, oh, I remember I put this over here and I'm going to move this over here, all of which is not possible when we're trying to do it all up here. And so I think that's also something we can really teach students, that when they're struggling to understand something, or to say structure a paper or something, it can be really helpful to get that out of your head and onto space, and then treat ideas and information as if they're physical objects that we can manipulate and move around, or like a three-dimensional landscape that we can kind of navigate through, and use those embodied resources to aid our cognition, and not expect it, to all happen up here.
That would be something I'd like us to start using, that terminology of cognitive offloading, and actually have strategies that we could give to the teachers of different ways that students can do some of that cognitive offloading based on their strengths and what's hard for them, and calling in resources from other children in the classroom that could come over, co-regulate, that sort of thing. I feel like we need to be able to see when our students get there. Before they've even come to school. Another PBS interview I was listening to is one particular school area. The children had to take a bus, way outside of the direct path to school, because the neighborhood had so much violence that they were scared they wouldn't get to school safely. So before they even walk into the classroom, they've already experienced this trauma of even getting to school. And so based on what you've studied, we have these students who walk into the door. What would you say would be like our first thing that we could do? Like you mentioned that one school that did the walk together.
Yeah. In order to clear students' minds, and
and just get them, they've already, if interoceptive wise, they're already feeling unsafe.
Right.
They've already had a lot of stress just getting to school.
Right.
And then we sort of just, okay, let's go. We maybe do a 5-minute ritual of something, but then we expect them to be right there.
I mean, well, in terms of what can we do for those students who arrive kind of already, affected by what's going on in their lives outside of school, we've mentioned a couple. There's the body scan, where you tune into your interoception, and there's the synchronous movement, which could help students get on the same page with their classmates. I think also about, and this is something we haven't really touched on so much yet, is the physical setting of the classroom can itself be a supportive resource. And I write in the chapter on thinking with built settings, built spaces, about the importance of having cues of identity and cues of belonging that are embedded in the space in which students learn. So cues or signals or signs that remind students of who they are, what their values are, what they're doing in that particular situation, because we all have many identities, but when students are in the classroom, you want them to be kind of priming their identity as scholars and students and curious explorers. And then cues of belonging let students know that people like me belong here. I'm part of a group. I'm valued here, and I'm part of a team. And so I think there's lots of ways that teachers can incorporate those cues into the classroom. One of them being allowing students to decorate or appoint their own spaces so that they feel that sense of ownership. And interestingly, the research suggests that when people feel they have ownership over their own space, they think more effectively in that space. I mean, it makes sense. We all have felt a little, ill at ease, in a place that doesn't feel welcoming, and because humans are such social creatures, we are so attuned to whether we belong or we don't belong. Paying attention to and being sort of vigilant about whether we belong, whether we feel that sense of belonging, that consumes a lot of mental bandwidth, and if a student can walk into a room, a classroom, and feel like this is my space, I share this space, but I belong here, and this is a place that I feel comfortable and welcomed, then they don't have to be worrying about that, and they can fully focus on their studies instead. Yeah, that's in the chapter on interoception, because it's about how when we tune into the sort of the ground floor of of what we're feeling, which is our physical sensations, before we add anything onto it and say I'm so nervous, or but okay, you feel nervous, but what's underneath that? What are you actually feeling in your body? And it might be something like, well, my heart is racing and I have butterflies in my stomach and my palms are sweaty. Well, all of those physical symptoms, they're identical to the physical symptoms that you feel when you're excited, when you're about to get on a roller coaster, or when are about to, when you're watching a scary movie that's sort of fun and exciting. And so if you attune yourself to the physical sensations first and foremost, then you can actually participate in the construction of your own emotion. It was found that when students who were going to take the GRE, this graduate placement exam, we're told, that if you feel nervous, if you feel, physical sensations of physical arousal, that's your body getting you ready for a challenge, and research shows that, I'm paraphrasing the words that they were told, but research shows that people who feel these physical sensations actually do better, than people who are more who aren't experiencing those internal sensations. So students actually who got that script to read before taking the test actually scored significantly higher on the test. So I think it's really interesting to know that we don't have to just take our emotions as they come to us. We can actually participate in shaping them, as long as the emotion that we're sort of constructing for ourselves is congruent with the physical sensations we're feeling. And that's why it really doesn't work. And this is something that a lot of us have tried, including myself. It doesn't work when you're feeling, aroused and sort of worked up like that, to say, calm down, tell yourself to calm down, because that's going against all the things that your body is just genuinely feeling. It's much more positive and effective to work with that and actually say to yourself, I mean, this sounds a little silly, but I have tried this and it works, to say, I'm so excited. I'm really psyched to give this speech or whatever, I'm so excited. And that's plausible. That's believable, because your body is in that state that can either feel nervous or you could construe it as excitement. And if you kind of just give it that tweak of telling yourself, I'm really excited. I'm really like, I'm ready for this. I'm ready for this challenge. It really can be very effective.
We've been all over the place, but your book has so much. So let's start with embodied cognition, and let's kind of summarize what's 2 things we can do in the classroom with embodied cognition, like just briefly what it is and what are 2 things we can do. And we'll do that with each section, kind of bring together. Yeah.
Yes. So embodied cognition is the idea, in our culture, we tend to separate mind and body as if they're separate, but they're actually, intricately intertwined. And we can often prime our brains to think better by changing what we do with our bodies. And 2 examples of that are, it turns out that gesturing is not just a kind of hand waving that accompanies what we say. It's actually an integral part of the thinking process. And the more we gesture, gesturing more can actually increase students' understanding and memory and just their ability to grasp a concept. So I love the idea of actually, it could be as simple as telling a student, instructing a student, try moving your hands when you explain that, because some kids are inhibited about moving their hands, or creating situations in which gestures are more apt to happen. And that might be calling on a student to give a kind of impromptu explanation in front of the class, because when we have to improvise, that's very cognitively demanding. We tend to offload some of that work onto our hands, and we start gesturing more, and that's what we want. We want more gestures. Or finally, students tend to gesture more when they have something to gesture at. So if you can provide a visual artifact of some kind that a student can point to, or use their hands around a map or a diagram or a model, that can be a really effective way of eliciting gesture.
Oh, your gesture section was amazing. And I thought the support staff that are listening, I thought we need to have gesturing be a part of our observation when we're looking at, we have our checklist and we're observing students. Well, that's a really interesting idea, is to be observing children. Do they, right off the bat, do they gesture or don't they? And then having them model gesturing. So as I'm learning something, have them model what I'm doing and gesturing as well. There's first here and then it's second. We do that, like we'll say first, second, third.
Right.
So your section was so good on the gesturing. So I'm glad you brought that into this embodied piece.
Yes.
I'm really glad you brought that up. So we've got gesturing and we've got our interoception, right? Those are 2 big embodied cognitive things that we can do in the classroom, right?
And physical movement, letting kids move. And also, when possible, having them act out or, literally kind of enact with their bodies what they're learning is, again, another really powerful way to enhance learning and memory.
We recall 50% more with stories than expository text. So we've done embodied cognition. So the next one is our situated cognition.
And thinking with place. Yes. So there, there's a very simple lesson from the chapter on thinking with natural spaces, and that is just try to get outdoors as much as possible. And when you can't, try to either make visual access to the outdoors possible, or bring nature indoors with like a green wall or houseplants, or even just natural motifs and materials in the classroom. And then we talked about cues of belonging and identity, and giving students some control whenever possible over their space. And then the 3rd chapter in that section is about the space of ideas. And we did talk about cognitive offloading and treating our thoughts as almost like a landscape that we can navigate through, and getting that stuff out of our heads and onto physical space.
And that leads us to your 3rd part, which is
which is cognition. People. And I did want to talk about those 3. I focus on 3 main social activities that we can bring into the classroom. Lots of teachers do this already, but things like storytelling, debating each other, and also teaching each other, because as we all know, the best way to learn something is by teaching another person. And there's so many opportunities for having students teach others. One of my favorites, I'll just mention this, is it turns out that students learn so much more from making an instructional video themselves, which is kind of a fun assignment to give to students, as opposed to watching passively an instructional video like a Khan Academy video. In part because when you're recording yourself, there's a sense, even if there's nobody there, there's a sense that you have an audience, and that social presence, which what psychologists call social presence, makes us more alert and more engaged, and we want to do a good job explaining ourselves to this sort of imagined audience.
So I have to end with your one thing. When I read a big book like this from them, I always say, okay, of all the things, what's the one thing you want us to, that we could do for ourselves and our students that could make everything else so much easier? Like if there was one thing, what do you think that would be? You know, it's hard, but.
Yeah. I think that the way we think about the mind is so important. It underlies everything we do as teachers and as thinkers. And so I would encourage people to put aside for now the metaphor of the brain as a muscle, and the brain as a computer, which is a really pervasive kind of metaphor that is embedded in our language and in our assumptions, and we just think that way all the time. I like to say that we're much more like animals than we are like machines, and yet we treat our brains and the brains of our students as if they're machine that's just like information in, information out. And instead, the human brain is very different from a computer. It's exquisitely sensitive to context. And so teachers are really situation creators, context creators. And when you think about it that way, it's so much less about the stuff that kids have in here and so much more about the situation that we're creating for them to think in. And I think that it can be very empowering for teachers and parents to think that way, that their job is to create congenial situations for kids to think in. And to me, that's like a really hopeful and optimistic way of thinking about what we do.
You have like one tip or two tips for online, because I know you're saying that small screens are much harder and much more cognitively demanding and exhausting as opposed to bigger screens where all the kids are on pretty much smaller screens. So when they're at school on their small screens too, and they're using a lot of that, they're not doing the distributed cognition, right? They're not socially engaged. They're just looking at that screen. Do you have any tips though if some people are still had to go back to online? I think most people are back in school, but just really quickly, a tip for us.
Yeah, I mean, one limitation with Zoom and these online platforms is that we're often just sort of like heads, in boxes. And if we can step back a little bit, have our students move away a bit from the screen, from their cameras, and we can move away a little bit from our cameras, get in more of that full body movement, get in more of that gesture, even have students stand up sometimes, because we tend to gesture more when we're standing than when we're sitting. And it turns out, interestingly, that when people speak with gestures, they speak more fluently. I mean, there's all kinds of benefits to the gesturer as well as to the people who are watching them. You saw the research about how we remember points made with gesture much better than points made without gesture. So I think if we could remember to bring our whole bodies into Zoom and not just be like a Brady Bunch kind of a face in a frame, that could really improve some of the online learning that we do. I think, again, about remote learning and how we spend so much time with these very unforgiving metal and glass, machines. And one part that I loved writing about in the book was about there's this researcher, Catherine Isbister, who studies fidget objects, the kinds of objects that people use to fidget with. And she had people send in pictures of what they fidget with. And it's available as a Tumblr account, like this gallery of images. And they were just a riot of like colorful, tactile, like all these often objects from nature, like a stone or a stick. And they and the fact that people wanted to touch these things and fiddle with them during the day suggests that we kind of want to remind ourselves that we have bodies and we're part of nature, and we want to play, and we don't just want to look
Yeah.
into a screen all the time. So I love the idea of fidget objects as like a reminder that we're embodied humans.
And any final thoughts? Get her book, Annie's book, anywhere you can buy a book. You all know where those places are. And write a review. I just did your review today, Annie. I'm sorry it took so long. I gave you your 5-star review today, but it really does matter. I think people do look at those. And so if you get the book and you like it, do take a few moments. It just takes a couple minutes to write a review and give Annie 5 stars. Thank you for your great work. It was wonderful.
Yeah, this was great.